Welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today is the end of my 4th week teaching on how to find, follow, and fulfill God's will. Next Friday, 1 week from today, will be my last day to teach on this. And so I spent about 2.5 weeks talking about how to find. I've only spent a week and a half talking about how to follow, and then I'll spend just next week talking about how to fulfill God's will for your life. And so I'm kind of speeding up on this. This teaching will go into more detail than what I've done on the last 2 things about how to follow and how to fulfill God's will. And so we'll give out all of the information about these products at the end. But this teaching is powerful. This has changed my life. 56 years ago is when this process started with me, and I'm still living by these truths that I've shared. And it has borne miraculous result in my life. And I know it would do the same thing for you. So I encourage you to please get these materials. We're asking for a donation for this 290-page book, but if you could not or would not send anything, we'll send this teaching to you on how to find, follow, and fulfill God's will, a little booklet that just summarizes it quickly, and you can get that. So I've already covered a lot of material. I can't go back through this, but I've been using Moses as an example throughout this second part about how to follow God's will. And I've shown that Moses knew what God's will for his life was, but he tried to accomplish God's will in his own strength, in his own power and ability, and he was going to do it on his own timetable. And because of that, it cost him 40 years in the wilderness, when I don't believe God's the one that sent him into the wilderness, and it cost the children of Israel 30 years extra bondage. And if you missed any of that, if any of the things I'm saying says, well, where did you get that from? Please get these materials because I've already shared that. What I want to do today is to go over to when the Lord appeared unto Moses in the burning bush, and this is listed in Exodus chapter 3. And it says in verse 1, Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush. There's a lot in these passages. I'm just going to say some things very quickly. But again, most people have been more influenced by the movie, The 10 Commandments, than they have been by the Word of God. And God's Word says over in Hebrews chapter 11 that Moses left Egypt, fled from Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, and he endured as seeing him who is invisible. The word endure doesn't mean that you just put up with something. It doesn't mean that you're just tolerating something. It's an active word, meaning that you are pursuing something with patience and you are standing against all of the opposition and things that come against you. So Moses wasn't in the desert trying to forget God as that movie, The 10 Commandments, portrayed. But he was in the desert knowing that God had called him to bring deliverance to the Jews. It said that in Acts chapter 7, and we already dealt with that. He knew it was God's will, but he had messed it up big time, but he hadn't let go of the fact that God had called him. And he was in the desert enduring, still seeking and seeking God. And notice it says that he saw this bush on fire. And you know, if you've ever been in a real arid climate or something like that, you know, when I lived out in the woods in Colorado, and we live in a semi-arid climate here, but when we had a lot of rain and things like that, I would burn my trash, and I would burn the grass that grew up around my trash barrels because if a spark got out, it could ignite the grass and start a fire. So I would burn the grass that was around my barrels as a buffer or protection. And when we had a lot of rain, I would have to get down there and hold a fire to that wood to that grass and even blow on it sometimes to get it to catch fire. But when we had been through a drought And Moses was in a desert place where, I mean, there was very little water. And sometimes I would just put a stick that was on fire and touch it to that clump of grass, and it would explode like this. And it would just instantly catch on fire and explode. And in Colorado, one of the reasons that we have so many wildfires in the West is because when it gets really dry and a fire hits a tree that is in drought situation, it will literally explode, and it can throw ashes, a quarter of a mile. And this is one of the reasons that these wildfires are just so bad. So some people who live in really damp climates may not realize that, but Moses was used to seeing the desert. I'm sure he had seen bushes that were on fire before, but they just would instantly burn and be gone. This one was burning, and it wasn't consumed. And so he said, I'm going to turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Do you know, he could have just been on his way home. He could have been going to Zipporah and the 2 kids, and it was, he'd had put in a full day, and man, she had supper waiting on him, and he could have thought, well, another bush burning. But see, this shows that he was looking. He hadn't forsaken God. He was enduring. He was looking and saying, God, give me another chance. And then it says in the next verse, in verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the burning bush. Why didn't God just call to him in the first place? He waited until he turned aside. And I think that there's many of us that miss encounters with God because we are just waiting on some dramatic thing, an audible voice or something. But God will always present himself in a way that you have to have faith to think, maybe this is God. You're looking for God. It doesn't just come upon you like a seizure. You know, in the New Testament, when the disciples were in trouble out on the midst of the sea, and it looked like they were going to drown, Jesus came walking unto them on the water. And in Mark chapter 6, it says he made as though he would have passed by them. It's obvious that the reason he was going out there was to help them, but yet he would have passed by them if they hadn't called out. God will always present himself, but it's in a subtle way. You have to be pursuing God, looking for God. Or as it says in Hebrews chapter 11, you have to be enduring, looking for something, looking for an opportunity. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside, then he spoke to him. If Abram had just been so intent on getting home and resting from a day's work that he hadn't have followed through on something, he could have missed God. And many of us miss God because we just aren't looking. You need to be looking. And when he saw that he turned aside, then he called to him. And there are 4 different times that he told Moses, now you go down and you're ready now. Go bring deliverance to the Jews. And Moses had totally changed. 40 years before this, when he knew what God's will was, he just thought, I'm going to go out and get it done in my own strength and power. And he went out and killed a man trying to bring God's deliverance to pass. But after 40 years in the wilderness, I believe that Moses had reached this place to where God, I can't do it. I failed. Now, he was still pursuing God, is what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. He was enduring as seeing him who is invisible. He wasn't running from God. He was seeking God and believing for another opportunity. But he had come to a place where he realized he couldn't do it in his own power. I tell you, you have to come to the end of yourself before you really find the beginning of God. Before God's power can really manifest through you, you have to get off of the throne. You have to lose your self-confidence and get to where you can do all things through Christ. Not you can do all things, but you can do all things through Christ. And there's not a lot of people that have done that. But Moses had come to the end of himself. And so 4 different times he says, God, I just can't do it. He wanted to do it. He was looking for God, but he had come to the realization that he had blown it. And now he had lost his position that he had in the royalty of Egypt. He had no clout whatsoever. He had nothing going for him now except a shepherd's staff. And so the Lord told him 4 different times that he could do it. And he said, no, God, I can't do it. And look down here in the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus. It says, and Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me. He had just said in the previous verses that these people will believe you. They are going to believe and they will follow you. And he said, no, Lord, They won't believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thine hand? And he said, A rod. It was just a stick. It was his shepherd's staff. He used it, to separate the sheep, maybe to count the sheep, to help him climb a hill or to fight off some animal that would come against the sheep. It was just a stick that he used. It was the tool of his trade. And he said, It's just a rod. And the Lord said unto him, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it. Here's Moses, according to Hebrews chapter 11, he had endured for 40 years. For 40 years, he'd been trying to somehow or another regain his equilibrium and say, God, I'll do it your way this time. What do you want me to do? He was seeking God. And after 40 years, he's in the presence of God. He's seeing the glory of God, a bush that's on fire, but it's not burning. He's hearing the audible voice of God. And yet when he threw his staff on the ground, it turned into a snake, and Moses was fleeing. He was headed the other direction. This is what he had been seeking for 40 years, an encounter with God, and yet he was willing to run away from it because of that snake. Some people don't mind handling snakes, but Moses wasn't one of them. You know what this was? Moses had spent 40 years in Bush University on the backside of the desert. He had been learning that, God, I'm sorry, I did it my way. Now I want to do it your way. Lord, help me to become a living sacrifice. Help me to renew my mind. And he had been seeking God for 40 years in Bush University. This was his final exam. So God said, what do you have in your hand? It was nothing but just a stick. It didn't have any more power than Moses had. If he had hit something really hard with this, it would have either jarred him or it would have broken the stick. There was no supernatural power in it. But when he threw it down before the Lord, it turned into a snake. And then look at this. And the Lord said unto Moses, Put forth thine hand and take it by the tail. Now, Moses wasn't the kind that liked snakes. But even if you like snakes, you don't grab a snake by the tail because it can turn and bite you and kill you. If you're going to grab a snake, you got to get it right behind its jaws so that as its body turns around, it can't bite you. For him to pick up this snake by the tail meant that he was not in control anymore. He was going to obey God, and it could cost him his life. He could literally die by obeying God. But for 40 years, he had been in Bush University saying, oh, God, give me another chance. So here's his chance. God says, pick it up by the tail. And did you know Moses didn't have the benefit of knowing what the last half of this verse said yet? He hadn't lived it. He hadn't written it. From Moses' perspective, to pick up this snake by the tail could have been death. But he was so committed that, God, I'll do it your way if it kills me. And when he picked it up by the tail, it says he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. But did you know, to other people, if somebody else would have, happened upon him right after this, and he had held this up, I'm sure it looked exactly like the rod looked before. It didn't change colors. It didn't somehow or another grow or become bigger. If you'd have taken a little shaving off of that rod, it would have been whatever kind of wood it was before, it still would have been that kind of wood. You could have had a scientist analyze it, and they would have still said it's, whatever, acacia tree or whatever. And they would have looked at it in only the physical, natural realm. But look what happened when Moses threw this rod down. It turned into a snake. He picked it up by the tail. Look what it says later in this chapter. It says in verse 20, And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. Back in verse 2, when God said, what's that in your hand? He says, it's a rod, it's a stick. It was Moses' stick. It didn't have any more power than Moses had. But now, once you surrender it to God and pick it up by the tail, which means that you aren't in control, you are totally at the mercy of God. You're doing things His way. Now it became the rod of God. And He could hold that rod out over the Nile and turn the entire Nile River into blood. He could hold it out over the land and it would make frogs and lice come up. He could hold it up to the sky and hail would fall out of a clear sky and fire run along upon the ground. He could hold it out over the Red Sea and it would part the Red Sea, because it wasn't his stick anymore. It was God's stick. It was the rod of God. And I'm telling you, I'm talking about how to find and follow. You've got to come to these same things that Moses did. And you may not have spent 40 years in Bush University the way that Moses did, but you have to spend some time learning to be a living sacrifice, learning that, God, I'll do it your way. And it doesn't matter how everybody else is doing it. I'm not going to follow the latest great trend and whatever's on, the internet and all of these kind of things. You're going to get a word from God, and you're going to do things God's way. And did you know, I experienced this, that when the Lord first touched my life, I had all of these plans for my life, and they looked like great plans. They're the plans that most people have. My family and things just seemed to dictate that this is the direction I was going. And yet when I encountered God on March 23rd, 1968, God told me to literally sacrifice my life to give up everything. And I decided to do it. And when I did that, it looked like it turned into a snake, and it was going to kill me. The very first decision I made, God told me to quit my secular education, that He didn't want me to go that direction. And because of it, I lost money from the government. I lost acceptance of people. I got drafted and sent to Vietnam. It looked like I could have died. And then when I came out, instead of going through seminary and getting a degree like most ministers do, God told me just to start ministering in these little tiny churches. And I ministered in 3 little churches over 6 years. And then He told me to go on radio and start traveling. And I did that for about 40-something years. And on I could go. But I just have been following God. And in the natural, it looks like some of the decisions I've made could have been the death of me. I remember when God sent me to 𝗵𝗃, Colorado. I came through there. I held a Bible study, and there was a man actually raised from the dead. And these people, it was just a little group of people, about 10, 12 people. And they said, you can't come in here and upset all of our theology and then just leave. You got to stay here and teach us. And I said, there is no way I am moving to 𝗵𝗃, Colorado. I mean, if you haven't ever been to 𝗵𝗃, Colorado, you hadn't missed much. If it's not the end of the world, you can see it from there. It's 30 miles from the nearest town, and 𝗵𝗃 only had 144 people in it, and it was dying. It's now nearly a ghost town. And there was no way I was ever going to stay there. But did you know what? Before I left town, God told me that this is where I've called you to be. And I was willing to give up my desire. I had visions of reaching people all around the world, and I guarantee you, you can't reach people from all over the world from 𝗵𝗃, Colorado. It looked like the death of my vision. I threw what I had down, just like Moses threw down his tool of his trade, his rod, and it looked like it was going to kill him. But he picked it up by the tail where he wasn't in control anymore. And all of a sudden, that turned out to be the miracle thing that God used to bring all of these plagues and all of the deliverance that Moses did. Likewise, when I yielded to God and went to places that it looked like that there was no way to leave there except feet first. It wasn't a stepping stone to any place. It was a preacher's, graveyard. And yet I obeyed God. And when I did, that's when I started on radio. That's when things began to start happening. And God used it. And now, looking back, I can't see how I would have got to where I am without going through 𝗵𝗃, Colorado. But at the time, it looked like it was just the death of a vision. God is going to bring every one of us to a place to where even if He shows you what His will for your life is, He's going to test you and get you to a place to will you sacrifice your son as Abram did with Isaac. Not that God ever really wanted him to sacrifice his son, but He wanted him to be willing to do that. Isaac was the one who all of the promises were going to be fulfilled through. And yet He wanted Abraham to get to a place to where I'm all you need. Will you literally put me above your son? And He asked him for that sacrifice. He asked me to give up everything that I had. He's asked so many people. This is what He did with Moses. And yet when you sacrifice, it's like Moses. He went down to Egypt, and this time it wasn't just his rod anymore. It was God's rod. And it would accomplish the supernatural things that God wanted to do. And I'm promising you that the biggest obstacle you will ever have to following God's will is your own understanding, leaning under your own understanding, doing things your way, having an overconfidence in your own ability and thinking that you can do things. You don't even have to have God. You can do it on your own. The biggest problem you'll ever face is looking at you in the mirror. And you have to learn how to be like Paul, to where he says, I'm crucified with Christ, and yet I live. Yet it's not me, it's Christ living in me. You have to get to where you have died to yourself, to your own wisdom, to your own confidence, your own ability, and you have to let God live through you. And it's not just a one-time experience. It's a continual experience that you go through. But man, to me, this is powerful. You have to lay your life down. And when you first do it, to your natural way of thinking, it'll look like this is going to kill me. This is the worst thing I could ever do. And it's not that God doesn't want you to prosper. God wants you to prosper more than you want to prosper. Psalms chapter 35, verse 27 says, let all those who favor my righteous cause say continually, let God be magnified, which hath pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. God is pleased when you prosper. He is not pleased when you don't prosper. God wants you to prosper more than you want to prosper, but he wants you to do it his way. He wants you to do it where you are dependent upon him and not your own understanding. And he will lead you in ways that don't make any sense to you or the people around you. It'll look like it's turned into a snake and it's going to kill you. But if you will pick it up by the tail, which means that you are no longer the one in control, you are now letting God call the shots. And you'll do anything. Then God will bless you. Moses for 40 years had been enduring and saying, God, give me another chance. I'll do it your way. God says, all right, let's see. And he told him to pick that snake up by the tail. And if Moses hadn't been yielded to God, I guarantee you, he would not have picked up a poisonous snake by the tail. This shows that he was willing to die obeying God rather than leaning unto his own understanding. And this is where we've got to reach, is to a place to where, God, I am not exalting my wisdom, I'm exalting your wisdom, and I will do anything, I will follow you. So you not only need to know what God's will for your life is, but then you have to learn how to follow it. And you do that by becoming a living sacrifice, yielding yourself 100% to God, and quit leaning under your own understanding. Man, that's powerful. Hello, this is Andrew Wommack, and if you've enjoyed our program there on YouTube, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share this with other people because, man, these truths will set people free. So check it out, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.